today we are going to be talking about Nemia and going through the basics of her playstyle and how to build this hero. So Zeong has been trying to create this archetype of a long-range hybrid single target and AoE damage archer, and I think Nemia is the final product of that, which is really strong, but not strong enough that she demands a very specific response to her. Going through her base kit, first off her talent, it gives her 30% attack at 6 star, which is actually quite unheard of for an archer unit. Usually the other archer units only get around 20% attack and maybe a mix of some crit chance or crit damage. And other than the base attack, she also gets the terrain effect, where she can select one block and apply this mysterious ocean current special terrain effect to it and the surrounding 2 blocks for 2 turns. So the size of this terrain effect will scale based on her star levels, and I would say she needs a minimum of 4 star to be playable, and at 4 star she basically gets a 3x3 square for the terrain effect. At 3 star it's a blast shape of 1 block, and that's kinda too small for her to be playable, I think. And this terrain effect, basically, after a unit takes action, if it is located on this special terrain, it will remove this effect, and then it will trigger an effect based on whether it's an ally or enemy, where if it's an allied unit, it will heal this unit by 15% HP and grant them 1 random buff. This is slightly weaker than Tenyu, but it's more or less the same buffs, except that the mobility that you get from it will only be +2. But if it's an enemy unit, when they step on it, they will take a fixed damage equal to 15% of their HP, and they will also gain a debuff, where they will regard the current terrain as water for 1 turn. So there's a cooldown for applying this terrain effect, and yeah, you can only trigger it after 1 turn. Finally, when moving through any allied mysterious ocean current terrain effects, Nemia will gain 2 blocks of mobility reduction mitigation, so she can kind of skip tiles basically, with her own tiles. Before moving on, just want to make a quick distinction between Nemia and McLean's tiles, because they are thematically similar and they also look similar for the tiles themselves. So they are both a 2-turn duration terrain effect, but in Nemia's case, the terrain effect will be consumed whenever any unit steps on it, whereas McLean's tile is strictly duration based and will remain there until either the timer is up or another terrain effect replaces it. So as mentioned in the talent, Nemia's terrain effect will heal an ally or damage an enemy, and then it will also grant a random buff to allies or give a water debuff to enemies after they step on the tile and consume it, which means that this buff or debuff is actually dispellable or immunizable. And this is not the case for McLean. So McLean's terrain effect is, as long as you stand on it, you suffer from an aura debuff that will basically regard your current terrain as water, and you can't really get rid of it except for getting off that terrain or overwriting the terrain. So Nemia's tile doesn't quite work like that, so you cannot just assume that you put the terrain effect on the enemy and then you can immediately make them treat their current terrain as a water tile. They will have to end turn on that terrain before that debuff will take effect. So yeah, just take note of that. For her skills, you will mostly see this loadout brought pretty much every game, which is her 3C, her unique 2C single target attack, and aim. For her 1-cost passive, it's actually a pretty decent support passive, where it will apply a buff to 2 closest ally within 2 blocks, which allows them to gain these 2 blocks of mobility reduction mitigation for 1 turn, which is basically part of her talent, but this one is only for herself. However, she kind of suffers from slot syndrome, so usually she won't have the opportunity to be able to bring this passive, because aim is too important for her to cycle her cooldowns as well as apply more terrain effects from her talent. And basically this cycle also gives her more range and gives her very high uptime on her attacks, so it's too important to give up for the passive, unfortunately. For her 2C single target attack, it does 1.5 times multiplier damage, and it has a super effective effect against aquatic units. When you enter battle, if the enemy happens to be in water, this attack will ignore guard as well as stun the enemy for 1 turn, and this stun cannot be dispelled. So it's a pretty bonkers effect if your enemy happens to be standing on water, so you will really want to pay attention to that when you're playing against the Nemia specifically. And if Nemia herself is on an allied Mysterious Ocean Current, you will deal 20% increased damage in this battle. So this is basically no contest compared to her other single target attacks. They all have just lower multipliers and their effects are not as great as this one. This 20% increased damage is more or less guaranteed if you play properly, and this stun is more like a very restraining effect where basically the enemy cannot walk on water tiles if it happens to be a water map. And this also works very well with the debuff from her tile and her AoE, which we will go through now. So first off, her 3C AoE has a passive, where if you are attacking with a skill, if you are on the allied terrain effect, her own terrain effect, you will get unit range +2 as well as the opportunity to retreat for another 2 blocks after attacking. So this is basically roundabout built into the 3C, but it also gives you +2 unit range, which is pretty nuts, and it's why she has such big threat range. So the AoE itself, it actually only attacks all enemies within one straight line, which is 5 blocks, and it does 0.4 times AoE damage, and it will give the debuff where they will regard the present terrain as water, as well as a 30% increase in fixed damage taken, which kind of synchronizes with her terrain effect, because the 15% HP of fixed damage, this will get increased by 30%. And this debuff lasts for 2 turns, and it will also apply her terrain effect to all affected blocks. If you happen to be on water or on an allied terrain effect, when using this skill, the skill span will increase to 3 straight lines. So this is basically a 3x5 AoEs, because you should always be standing on an allied terrain effect when you use this AoE, which is also partially why aim is so important for both of these skills. Because when you click aim, you can then apply the terrain effect, then you move on to the terrain effect, and then you use your spells, and you will get this plus range as well as the retreat function. And also, whatever bonus effect like this 20% damage and this AoE range increase. So yeah, basically your 3 skills are gonna look like this. And yeah, the passive, unfortunately, you don't really have the space to bring it. Like, strictly speaking, if you're running a full support build, you could give up the single target attack and bring the passive, but you do that at your own discretion, and I wouldn't quite recommend it. So a couple of things that you will want to keep in mind when you play Nemia. So first thing is her AoE, although you will get the full AoE range when in water, you have to pay attention that the bonus range can be applied in water, but the retreating after attacking has to be when Nemia is attacking from her own terrain effect. So in a situation where maybe you don't have aim, but you want to run the maximum distance to hit more enemy units, and then there's a water tile, so you run all the way and then you use your AoE. So take note that if you do that, you actually cannot retreat, even though you're on water and you think you have the so-called bonus effect because your AoE is on the water effect. But that is actually not the case, and you will be stuck there. So the next thing is basically how you use your talent terrain effect when in combination with the aim. So usually it will look like this. You will aim, you will place this terrain effect like somewhere, maybe like this, or let's just do this for now. So this also demonstrates one important thing, which is that Nemia, if you place the terrain effect like this, where it is in range of where you are currently standing, Nemia will actually immediately consume this terrain effect in order to get the buff. So damage taken plus 10 is from aim, mobility plus 2 is from my breeze. So this damage taken minus 20 is what I get from immediately consuming my water tile. What this means is that if you're trying to attack without moving, it's actually not possible because you will immediately consume your tile effect. So you will at least need to move 1 block, and then you can get your 4 range single target attack, or your big AoE or whatever. So after you attack like this, you can get your 2 blocks of move again, right? From the passive. But because when you aim, and then you only move 1 block to attack, so you can actually carry over this penalty, mobility reduction, whatever that term is. Mobility reduction mitigation. So yeah, this actually carries forward from the aim turn. So because I only move 1 tile, which immediately consumes 1 chance of mobility reduction, I can then carry the second tile of mobility reduction forward, and then I can move 3 tiles back. So you will want to keep this in mind when you are using Nemia to attack, and maybe you can get an extra opportunity to retreat further back. And following that here, so Nemia's mobility skip effect can actually be carried forward. So what do I mean by that? Okay, let's just not use that. So because Nemia Breeze it's a bit harder to see the mobility, but basically if you count, okay, now she's running through her tile effects, right? She gets 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is 4 plus 2, right? Wait, no, that sounds a bit wrong actually. Okay, never mind, she's just blocked off. So okay, like this, 1, 2, 3, and then this will consume the extra mobility. So it's skip, skip, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you're already skipping 2 tiles here, and City Wall consumes 3 more movement for aquatic units. You can then click aim, place your terrain effect, and then you can move another 4 blocks, which is 2 from the aim and then 2 from her talent skipping the mobility effect. So you can actually benefit from this effect twice in the same turn if you use aim, which gives her a shitload of mobility, because like if you use the line skill AoE just to give yourself movement for next turn, you can move at a minimum 6 plus 4 and then have a 4 range single target attack, which is why her range is so damn oppressive. So there's basically 2 ways for Nemia to be able to put the enemy in water for her to gain the bonus effects for her 2C single target attack. The first one is basically her AoE. The AoE itself will immediately give this all terrain is treated as water debuff, which is not to be confused with the debuff that you get from ending the turn. So they did not get this debuff from the tile, they got this debuff from the AoE itself. So like I mentioned earlier, you cannot just slap this terrain effect beneath the enemy's feet and then immediately try to ignore guard. It doesn't work that way. They will have to end the turn before they get this debuff. It's the same debuff, but don't be confused about the source of this debuff. And final thing I just want to bring up is basically how you cycle through Nemia's tiles. So because the talent actually only has a 1 turn cooldown, the timing is actually a little bit off. So depending how you use Nemia. So here I use AoE, but let's say you use this single target attack. So you aim, you place your terrain effects, and then you attack the enemy. So then you retreat after that. So both these skills will be on cooldown, but on your next action you will have the opportunity to place more terrain effects. So whether you place them or not will depend on what the map looks like basically. So let's say if you already used an AoE on the previous turn and your map looks kind of like this, you can use this current action, you end turn, and then you place the Nemia terrain effects on allied units, so that you can either heal them or try to grant them some kind of random buff. However, if your Nemia is getting ready to attack again next turn, because as you can see, aim comes off cooldown and so will Coral Volley after you use aim. So if there isn't enough terrain effects in an offensive position, you will want to hold that talent terrain effect so that you can use it when you next click your aim, so that you can get your 4 range as well as your retreat. So don't just spam the terrain off cooldown is basically what I'm trying to say. You kind of have to look at the situation and whether you can already have existing terrain effects when you're trying to attack before you decide whether to use it for buffing and healing purposes. So part of the reason why Nemia is so strong in PvP is because of her ability to do this on player 1. On her first action, she can just run straight away all across the map and basically hit every single enemy unit from spawn. So, I mean, she has two options, right? After she aims, her mobility is gonna look like this. So she either has the option of going here, and her single target will be able to hit these 4 tiles, assuming that Nemia is able to run in a straight line on the maps, which is most maps except for Sky, Volcano, and Desert. And then she can either have the option of basically zoning all enemies from these 4 tiles if she wants a single target, or if the enemy has a tank or they are like not in range for her single target attack, her AoE is going to clip their entire enemy team and put all of them in water. So this final tip is more of a mobility reduction effect tip rather than a Nemia specific one, but you can apply this to her as well. So in this example, Nemia used her aim and then she placed her tiles. And you can see that Nemia is able to walk for the full 4 blocks, which is 2 from her aim and 2 from her mobility skip effect, despite running through an enemy Yanni portal, which normally will force you to consume 1 additional mobility point, as well as there being a mountain tower here, which normally consumes 3 movement for aquatic units. So none of that affects Nemia, and she is actually just able to skip right through. So the way this works is mobility reduction skip effects will usually apply to the very first tile you encounter throughout your path. You can't really pick and choose, but you can pick and choose where you place your terrain effects, and in this case, because the first 2 tiles that she ran through, these 2 tiles, has her terrain effect, so she's skipping these 2 tiles and then using her aim mobility on these 2 tiles, which allows her to get the full 4 movement. So to really drive home that concept, you can kind of see the other destinations from this action. To get here, basically what's happening is Nemia is skipping this tile, which happens to be the first step that she takes. So this tile also happens to be the specific tile where the Yanni portal penalty will apply. So she skips through the penalty itself and then she walks 2 blocks upwards after that. So the portal doesn't say go like, oh, you bypassed my mobility increased effect, so I'm gonna penalize you again on the next tile. No, that's not how it works. Because the very first tile you will suffer the penalty, but at the same time, the first tile that you run in is also her terrain effect, which allows you to completely skip that tile. So you effectively just bypass the mobility and you can go straight through. And when you're going straight up, you can only go 2 tiles. You can't reach this tile because this specific tile doesn't have the Nemia effect. So you're consuming the full 2 mobility from the aim, and then you're skipping the next tile. So yeah, that's basically how terrain reduction effect works. As for the rest of her base kit, her class is basically going to be Fairy's Hope because this is the class that will give her 4 base movement. So you kind of just don't care about everything else. Movement is king here. For the stones, I'm going for this attack HP, double crit, and then suffered crit damage. So double crit is just to try and RNG max out my damage cap. And then I put suffered crit here so that she has a better chance of surviving certain 1-hit KO AoE attacks. Because I think Nemia is basically too squishy to be worth investing defense on anyway. So I'm going the minus crit damage route to try and survive certain attacks. For her soldiers, is very straightforward. Basically, she only has very few options. First one is going to be Fairy Spirit Prophet, which is a very good troop because it does magic damage, and basically it means that Nemia will be doing hybrid damage on her single target attacks because her hero does physical and then her troop is doing magical. And then the other option for her DPS Nemia would be this Island Ambassador, which is a physical damage troop, and it basically gives 30% stats, and then when you are attacking any enemies in water, you will ignore 20% of their defense in this battle. because if you're in water, the effect is doubled and the unit does not suffer melee damage penalty. So mostly you are going to be bringing this Prophet because it's just more universal. But if you are on a very big water map, which is like like the boat map in Apex Arena, you can consider this troop because Nemia has no way to put herself in water, unlike McLean. Her terrain effect does not grant herself the water buff. So you will have to be on an actual water tile in order to use an aquatic troop. And you only really get the maximum benefit when you're attacking enemy units who are also in water anyway. So this is more of a situational pick, but it can be pretty useful because it gives you the no melee damage penalty, which means that if certain physical attackers that melee you, they might die to counter if they are attacking you with this troop. There's another option in Sorceress, which is basically a less stable version of the Fairy Spirit Prophet, but this can be kind of useful if you're trying to tank a magic attack and you're just gambling that the enemy doesn't have Twilight Star, because the Sorceress and Death, the Mage Holy Light effect from the troop training, as well as Last Rites, can make her pretty tanky against a magic attack, but you should only bring this troop if you know what you're doing. And the reason why there are so little troop options for Nemia is because she has base 4 movement. So you have base 4 movement, and if you bring any of these other troops, your unit movement will get nerfed into 3 because the troops are moving lesser. Otherwise, Dwarf Adventurer could be a pretty decent option to increase her AoE damage on her 3C if you're specifically drafting her for that purpose. But because of the mobility aspect of it, you can't really bring any of these other troops. Which means that Nemia actually doesn't really have a consistent physical damage troop because, again, Iceland Ambassador requires there to be an actual water tile. And this Wild Expedition unit only has base 3 movement as well, so that's a no-go. So yeah, either the Fairies or Iceland Ambassadors most of the time. As for her equipment, I'm just gonna go with this build. Crystal Stinger, Last Rites, King's Crown, and Judge Talisman is my options. Last Rites and King's Crown for now is pretty non-negotiable. There's no other alternatives that can come close. King's Crown, King's Crown can buff an ally, and she can't really use the Boon Bonnet because the hero is really squishy, and usually you place bonnets on units that can self-heal and then try to bruiser win the end game. So usually you place them on tanky flyer units or like Lost Hand because they're self-heal. But that's not really the case for Nemia. Her 15% HP heal it's not really worth it basically, and her cooldowns are short, but not short enough that she can be considered an endgame bruiser. So these two are kind of locked in place. For Crystal Stinger, I think Crystal Stinger just gives her the max single target damage, especially if you can get her to crit. But if you don't want to use Stinger, there's also the option of using the Prismatic Destroyer, basically I call it the gunbow, and this will maximize her AoE damage. So if you are playing a primarily AoE focused box, you can basically use this as an option, and you are basically drafting her 90% of the time to just fire off a 3C on the entire enemy team at the start of the match. Then this weapon will be the best bang for your buck. As for her accessory, I'm playing Judge Talisman because I have an OP enchant on it, and this crit is actually pretty big if you want to use Nemia to try and tank boss, because Crystal Stinger has a crit damage aspect to it. But another option would be Twilight Star, and with this you can try to basically break through Last Rites. So basically if you are gambling against enemy SP Bernhards, or if you're trying to kill something like a God Hand, then Twilight Star can be better in that aspect. But Judge Talisman basically is against Lightbringer, or if you're trying to ignore guard against certain healers on water maps. Basically use whatever enchant you have that is better, I suppose. And if you are playing her with the AoE gun, you are playing for her AoE, then don't use Twilight Star, just use a 8% attack accessory. As for the enchants, I think Breeze is the most universal, but if you are going full magic damage, magic can be an option, obviously. As well as if you're going full single target, then Meteor can actually be a pretty legit option as well, because she actually has the base stats, or rather the base attack to actually back up a Meteor enchant. And that's basically it for this unit. Hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.